Hear now these words of Jesus, a parable he tells in the Gospel of Matthew. Now when the Son of Man comes in his majesty and all his angels are with him, he will sit on his majestic throne. All the nations will be gathered in front of him. He will separate them from each other, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right side, but the goats he will put on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who will receive good things from my Father. Inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world began. I was hungry, and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then those who are righteous will reply to him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and give you clothes to wear? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" Then the king will reply to them, "I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me." God speaks to us through the reading of Scripture. In these few minutes, I want us to think, continuing our series, Christmas Inside Out, about Christmas outside the walls. Outside the walls. As Paige mentioned a moment ago in her prayer, we build walls. We have lots of walls. We dwell within walls. We work within walls. We educate within walls. We are housed and fed within walls. Walls have their purpose. We nurture one another, love one another as families within walls, and worship within walls. But walls can also be a problem. Walls can divide, walls can separate. And Ephesians 2 says that Christ tore down the dividing walls. Christ tore down the dividing walls. So the one whose birth we celebrate is the one who came to tear down the walls that divide and the walls that hold captive. This past week in my article or blog, if you saw that, you noted that I quoted in its entirety Robert Frost's poem, Mending Wall. And he begins with, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." And then he tells the story, it's told in the first person throughout the poem, of a man and his neighbor getting together once a year in the spring after the winter freezing and thaws, and after hunters have climbed back and forth over the stacked stone wall that separates their property. They get together and they walk, one on one side, one on the other. They walk along the wall and they restack the stones. They mend the wall that separates the two of them. And the speaker in the poem begins to question why they do this. Why do they have the wall in the first place? And then he says, "Before I built a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." And that's true. But we would say, I believe, it's someone who doesn't love a wall, someone who wants it down. Christ has come to tear down the dividing wall, Ephesians says. Whatever that wall is that would divide us one from another. We can think about that. There are lots of possibilities. We know that sometimes we build walls that are really built more or less out of the stones of self-righteousness, as the Pharisees did in their time. Sometimes when we are people of faith, when we are religious people, we can draw distinctions between ourselves and others that, whether we mean to or not, can wall people out. That's why Jesus warned so much about judgmentalism. That's why Jesus was critical of really only one group, and that was not the tax collectors, who were very corrupt. That's not the sinners, those who didn't follow all of the aspects of the law. Those were the outcasts that the Pharisees had identified as outcasts. In fact, Jesus spent a lot of time with them and ate with them. But rather, the group that he had the most problem with was the group of Pharisees, who were very righteous people. In fact, they sought to live very holy lives, particular to follow the letter of the law. But unfortunately, what had happened is they had fallen into judging others in the process. And so we can build walls in that way. And Christ came to tear down the dividing walls of judgmentalism. He came to tear down the walls that we build out of shame and guilt around ourselves, and walls of resentment that we build around ourselves as well. You know it to be true that sometimes when we are feeling bad about ourselves, when it's not just guilt, justified guilt over something we've done wrong, but when we begin to feel that somehow we are wrong, that somehow morphs into shame, we build a wall to protect ourselves. Or we nourish resentments, and we care for these grudges that we have, and we allow walls to be built between us and another as we hold a grudge, a wall that begins to divide and separate us from another. I think about a man and his son who I knew very well, who had fallen into this bitterness in their relationship. The father had an addiction problem, and there were lots of hurts, lots of mistakes, and they had gotten to the place where they would not even speak to each other. It was terrible. They had built walls that separated themselves. It is as though they had walked along and purposely built a wall between them, stacking stone by stone, resentment by resentment, until they were separated by that wall. And then the son and his wife had a baby girl. And when the baby came into the picture, the baby did what no one else could seem to do. The baby began to dismantle that wall. That somehow, in the presence of the love for that child and the love of that child, resentment could not hold up. The wall could not stand, and it fell between the two of them. Someone there is who doesn't love a wall, who wants it down. And that includes walls of resentment. It includes the way we might wall ourselves off from others. Sometimes we wall ourselves away from others because of a fear of the other or indifference toward the other. I mean, let's face it, we are busy people. As Richard said a moment ago when he spoke to us about this season, we are busy people. We have a lot going on. We have a lot happening within our four walls, whether that's the four walls at home or at work or wherever we are. And that can, unfortunately, mean that we build these walls where they become walls of indifference. We really don't pay attention to the other, or we're afraid of the other, and it keeps us within ourselves. It's really this that Jesus' parable today speaks to. Christ, the one who came to tear down the dividing walls, tells this parable about of the great judgment, it's called, of the great king on the throne separating sheep from goats. And the ones who are righteous have reached out and have done something for someone in need. And he says, it is as though you have done it to me. When you do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you have done it to me. That's how much Christ wants the dividing walls torn down, opened up, taken away. Whatever it is that separates and holds us captive. M.A. Matthews tells the story of the beginning of Advent, the most memorable beginning of Advent for him, when he looked out of his living room window and he saw the new nativity scene set up on the lawn of the church across the street from where he lived, happened to be his church also. And he watched children getting out of school and excited when they saw the nativity scene because they knew that it meant Christmas was coming, and they stopped to look at it only briefly because it was so bitterly cold, and then they went on home. But one little girl stayed behind, and he watched as in that bitter cold she took the scarf off from around her neck and she covered the baby Jesus in the manger with it, and she bent over even and gave him a kiss on the cheek. And he said, at that moment, I knew that Christmas had arrived once again. How did he know? He knew because that's exactly what the coming of the Christ child means, that we will do to others as if we were doing that to the Christ child himself. Somehow that little girl knew intuitively that she needed to do something. She wanted to do something to help the child. And someday, of course, I'm sure she would grow up to learn that the way you do that is not by putting a scarf on a statue, but you do that by putting clothing on one who does not have adequate clothing, shelter for one without shelter, food for one who is hungry, drink for one who is thirsty, a visit for one who is in need, ill, imprisoned, welcoming the stranger. These are the ways in which we tear down the walls that would divide us. These are the ways in which we minister to the Christ child himself. That's how we know the season has arrived, when we really, really get that. Among my possessions, and I'll close with this, is a little piece of concrete that my sister brought back to me from Germany in 1990. It's a chunk of concrete, has some spray paint on the flat side of it. And I'm sure many of you know I'm talking about a piece of the Berlin Wall. A wall that began to be dismantled on the 9th of November, 1989. A wall that loomed large in the 20th century as a dividing line between East and West, as a wall that divided people one from another, a wall that held captive people and separated people from one another, and that wall started to come down in November of 1989. The interesting thing is we don't often think about it, at least I don't, but it took a long time for the wall to come down. It didn't happen overnight. I think in my imagination, even though I saw the films, and perhaps the reason I think that is I saw the films with that big sections of the wall falling and people dancing on top of the rubble, that it happened very quickly, but it really happened over a period of months and months. It began with people with pickaxes, with hammers and chisels, sledgehammers, beginning to dismantle that wall piece by piece, a piece very much like the little piece that I have at home. And it happened gradually. And do you know that they had a nickname for all those people who dismantled the wall? They called them wall woodpeckers. Just as a woodpecker over and over again pecks at a tree until it finally has a hole in the tree and gets to the food inside, so all of these people with their chisels and their hammers and all those little implements holding them in their hands, they chipped away piece by piece by piece. They were like woodpeckers chipping away bit by bit to dismantle an entire wall. I can't think of a better image for who we are called to be. As those who chip away in every way that we can, with whatever we have in our hands, with whatever we possess, and whoever we are, and whatever talents and abilities, that we chip away at the walls that divide and separate and hold captive. Because we follow the one who doesn't love a wall, who wants it down. Amen.